Hello, my name is Christopher Singh, and I work as an animator on the skins team for League of Legends. In this video, I wanted to show the animation process that I went through while working on Omega Squad Veigar's recall. I'll be discussing my general thought processes as I go through each stage of animation, focusing on what I look out for and the challenges associated with each step. This video won't go into too much detail about animation theory or principles, as I'll be focusing more on how the animation itself evolved over time, as well as the choices I made along the way. Now, the first thing I normally try to do is brainstorm an idea, and this is something that can be done by myself, and sometimes it's something that I do with other artists that are working on the skin. For Veigar's recall in particular, we kind of wanted to show something a bit more lighthearted and humorous to help contrast with the more serious Omega Squad thematic. You can see me posing Veigar out here right now, and this early process of putting down poses is normally referred to as blocking. Most animators do this to broadly create the fundamental groundwork for their shot, and I'm currently blocking out Veigar's animation in stepped mode and not spline. Stepped basically means no interpolating between keys, while spline means interpolating. Both styles have their advantages and disadvantages, but in this workflow, we deal with the spline curves at a later stage. You'll notice that I'm working on a timeline with 260 frames, which converts to about 8.6 seconds if we use 30 FPS. Recalls in League of Legends are 8 seconds long, or 240 frames. But all the recalls in the game actually have this small wind up before their actual 8-second channels start, which is pretty similar to the small delay that a lot of non-instant cast abilities in League have before a champion fires a spell. While blocking, I try not to focus too much on body mechanics or perfect timing and spacing because that can all be addressed in Blocking Plus. The priority at this stage is to be able to quickly show an idea to the other artists and get aligned on whether or not the direction is working. This isn't really to say that fewer poses are better for blocking. It really depends more on what action you're trying to sell. For example, a comedic reaction would rely more on the timing of really strong poses, whereas a realistic motion, such as gracefully sitting down, would require many more poses to properly convey the serenity and calmness. It really just boils down to what tone and style the animator is trying to communicate at the time. One thing that we have to really keep in mind while animating too is the camera angle at which League of Legends is viewed at. League has a 3/4 top-down perspective, and making sure that a character's movements are readable from that angle is kind of similar to how stage actors try to always face the audience regardless of if they're facing left or right on stage. It's true that characters in League can be seen from all angles, but the main game is still viewed from this top-down perspective, so that's kind of where most of our efforts need to be focused on. Eventually I get to a point where I feel like the shot is ready for some feedback, so I play blast it out and I show it to the team. This early blocking phase is going to be acting as our guiding compass moving forward, and we really don't want to lose time exploring in the wrong direction, so getting alignment on that first is important. So here's my initial blocking pass. Veigar puts away his weapon, a missile spawns on the ground. Veigar tries to explode it with the remote. He gets upset and tries to use the missile dud to explode the helicopter. There were a couple main points of feedback that I got. The first one being that staging is not clear. People had questions like, where does the missile come from? What is he doing with the missile? Why is the missile even stuck on the ground? I failed to set up the shot in a way that was intuitive, and this made it very difficult to follow, which relates to the second part of the next point being, story is too complex. A lot of the ideas weren't really cohesive, and there were just too many of them. 8 seconds in a recall really isn't very much time to tell a complicated story, so sometimes simpler is better. Here I immediately delete about 60% of my keyframes, and this is sometimes painful to do because I personally get pretty attached to my work that I've done over the course of many hours, but what theoretically sounded pretty good in my head in the beginning really didn't work out. And thus being able to pivot on ideas that aren't working is pretty important in saving time. This is pretty similar to R&D projects where rapid prototyping in the beginning of research allows you to get to better solutions faster. And so not being too emotionally attached to your work is a pretty good thing. For my reblocking, I have a new goal of trying to create a simpler story where Veigar expects something big and exciting to happen, but instead, the unexpected occurs and he overreacts. In this case, I wanted Veigar to try to shoot a missile, have it malfunction, and fearing for his life, tries to escape with a helicopter cable. The longer the build-up, the bigger payoff we expect. And to sell something similar to in the recall, I really want to exaggerate Veigar's reaction when he realizes that the missile is still armed, even though it didn't fire properly. So here, I try spending some extra time focusing on him dropping the remote and having a super crazy expression. I add an antic pose here and some cartoonish expression lines to really help convey his surprised mindset. Do remember that one of the main reasons why I'm reworking almost the entire shot is because the first version of my blocking wasn't strong enough. So much of actual animation builds on top of the first blocking pass, and it's imperative to make sure that the idea in your blocking is awesome. And here we are again with the new recall. This time, Veigar tries to aim, fire a missile, only to have the armed missile fall on the ground, causing him to panic and try to escape. Overall, it's a pretty good improvement. The simple story arc of trying to fire the missile and finishing on a fun little character moment for Veigar makes it a lot easier to understand what Veigar is thinking, doing, and feeling. People generally like this new direction, so I asked the 3D artist if he could help me model all the new assets like the missile launcher. He said yes, and we were all good to go. Now that everyone, including me, is happy with the new direction, we start getting into the real juicy meat of animating. I use Blocking Plus, basically to set myself up for success for the next phase. Since we figured out the overall idea for the recall already, this is where I can now refocus on the animation principles and look at timing, spacing, physicality, arcs, and all that jazz. You'll notice that this is where I begin looking at the graph editor a lot more. Here I look for a lot of opportunities to clean up messy looking points and add some interest to flat looking ones. I also have to revisit sections where I put in some very, very few frames, since those will definitely not hold enough information for when I move on into splining. Let's take the ending of the recall where Veigar sort of runs around and hops around, for example. I really only had one frame here for every step that he took as he jumped around, and because of the timing posing, it did convey the comedic intent. But if I were to spline my animation in this state, it would definitely look pretty crappy, soggy, and awkward. Here's a quick side-by-side comparison of the simple blocking I did early on compared to the Blocking Plus version. And when they're both splined, you can see how much you lose in the one with less keys and breakdowns. Blocking Plus for me is very similar to the initial idea blocking. It's really focused on not so much the idea, but more specifically the animation craft. Knowing when your block animation is ready for spline is always really challenging, and if, when you spline, your animation looks really bad, be sure to continue blocking in more frames until there's enough detail and specificity. Splining is where we finally allow the computer to connect the dots, interpolate between our keys. It's a strange transition because now our character isn't teleporting and freezing every few frames, but sometimes the animation almost looks unrecognizable from before because of how different it feels. Splining an entire 260 frame shot across hundreds of controls sounds like a really daunting task, and it is. But something that's been actually helping me a lot recently with large shots like these is trying to focus solely on an individual chunk, one control at a time. I usually find that starting with the root control is the most effective, because usually that acts as the main motivator for movement of the character. And a solid root motion can help animating things like the hands, the feet, and the spine. Spline curves also end up being a lot easier to see where things look wrong. If you look in the graph editor, awkward looking curves are much more visible when they have lines drawing the points together, and it's pretty important to update these to look nice as you run into them. Here I'm going through the end of the animation where Veigar runs around and grabs a helicopter cable. I'm taking this chance as I'm splining to add extra stretches and breakdowns that I didn't key in blocking or blocking plus. At this stage, it's pretty important to add in anything that you forgot to add in the earlier stages, because this is basically the last opportunity to do so. And this is what everything looks like after splining. It definitely looks a lot more like the final animation, and a lot of it actually feels really, really nice. The feedback now is actually much more focused on finding all the extra 10% flavoring that we can add. Animating the ears, offsetting the feet, hands, and fingers, adding a little bit more squash and stretch, more anticipations, more settles. These are all things that we can continue to embellish this further with. It does sound like a lot, but this is probably, for me, the most fun part. Just like in splining phase, I like to take my polish phase one section at a time. I've already worked pretty heavily on the root control and splining, so here I want to focus in the graph editor with the curves that deal with Veigar's head, and offset keys so that when his head turns, it leaves in one rotational axis and doesn't start or settle all at once. I can also add some changes in the translate Y graph here for his head to get some of the nice squash and stretch between the head and the body, which isn't something that I had in the blocking or spline. Polish here is all about doing small things like this across the entire animation. This applies to all parts of the character, so feet, hands, body, head, eyes, fingers, props. You'll notice that a lot of times the curves have some extra noise that I smooth out to make my curves look as pretty as possible. I personally find that it's important to make sure your curves are clean and crisp, since it's really the graph editor that dictates what your character is doing at all times. I will caveat this by saying that nobody besides animators really get to see what the curves look like. So ultimately it doesn't really matter if the graph editor is messy, because if the animation looks beautiful in game, it looks beautiful in game. The graph editor, however, is a super useful tool, and if an animation in Maya looks a bit wonky, usually you can look at the graph editor and see that it's because the curves inside there are all doing really weird things that they shouldn't be doing. There's just something about nice looking curves that makes me really happy. Here we have the new models for the recall, so I'm just trying to transfer my old animation onto the new assets. I spent some time focusing on really trying to make the missile shoot out quickly from the launcher and then fall dead on the ground. Hand contacts with objects in 3D animation are always challenging because they're ultimately faked. Animation is always the illusion of physicality and character. So even though the hand and missile launcher don't actually exist, we have to kind of emulate what a hand touching an object will look like. So here I animate anticipation pose for the hand before it touches the launcher, so that when the hand does finally hold the launcher, the pose change is visible. Having the fingers noticeably wrap around the object helps it make it feel like the hand is actually interacting with it. I even animate the head of the cannon to wiggle a tiny bit when Veigar pushes it. Things reacting to one another is what really makes contacts feel nice. And this idea for contacts in animation is actually further shown when his hand slides off the side here. I have the fingers bending backwards as the hand peels off, and seeing them bend backwards gives the impression that the cannon is a physical object and is exerting a force on the fingers as they pass by. The exact same thing applies here too when Veigar presses the remote button. When he strikes the remote, the button depresses, his finger bends backwards, the remote squeezes a little bit, all before returning to a more neutral position. Having this small extra overshoot creates the illusion of force and is what gives the action a feeling of oomph. I also didn't get to show this much anywhere else in the video, but it's super important for us to make sure that we preview all of our work in the game so that we know what it will ultimately look like. And if there are some things that don't look great in game, then we do have to make the necessary adjustments. And since I'm already pretty focused on the hands and the fingers, I continue to pose them out throughout the rest of the recall, tracking the silhouette of the palms and the fingers, trying to make sure that they all follow a nice path and have some really good shape changes. Here I stretch out his reach as he's grabbing for the cable, and really try to make the hand read like it's opening and closing. I also try to add some delay to their translates and rotates relative to the body so that they feel more natural. And the very last thing I work on for Veigar are his ears. This was probably the part that I was looking forward to the most. I had posed out his ears a little bit in the blocking phase, but what I really wanted to add were those really small ear flicks and twitches that cats do when they're slightly agitated or startled. I've never owned a cat or a dog, and I learned that cats have over 20 muscles in each ear, and they move up and down, flat and sideways and backwards, and they can actually swivel 180, and even move independently. So I looked up some reference on YouTube and Pinterest and found a nice slow motion video where I could see the ear flick down on one side really quickly, and then the ear would swivel forward, overshoot a little bit before settling back into its new position. So I tried applying this concept throughout the rest of the recall, and to add a little bit of that extra flavor and touch, cute touch. So after many hours of blocking, splining, polish, and feedback, the animation is done. So as a really quick recap of what my process was like, blocking phase focuses on trying to pitch an idea to the team and get buy-in. Focusing on the core idea with very few poses allows me to get people's eyes on it earlier so that I do not waste time exploring the wrong direction for too long. During the blocking plus phase, I try to set myself up for success by beginning to focus on the character physicality and adding more definition to my curves. Again, if not enough information is key during this process, then the following splining phase will be much more of a headache. The splining phase is where the animation begins to take its final form, and things that were not addressed in either the blocking or blocking plus phase need to be addressed immediately, since the further we get down into polish and splining, the harder it is to turn around. Making sure to clean up your curves as they come, making small adjustments to foot placements, overshoots and settles, timing and spacing. These are all things that may be necessary because spline animation feels very different from stepped animation, and sometimes you just need to play it by ear. And the final phase is polish, and I doubled down on tracking arcs, fingers, adding all these really subtle things like blinking and ear twitches, offsetting fingers. Polish theoretically can go on for an infinity. You can get into even more and more minute details, and that really gets into polish plus, where you sort of get diminishing returns when you go into further polish. Polish plus is not always necessary, but sometimes it's good to be able to flex your muscles and try to go 120% and go all the way. And that basically wraps everything up. Please feel free to leave feedback on the things you liked and did not like. I definitely want to make more videos like this in the future, and any comments or thoughts will be very helpful. I hope you guys found some of this information useful, and I'll see you guys around next time.